Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Committee. Hope everyone had a great summer. Very nice to see everyone in person. I want to announce that Councilmember Glass is unable to join us today, but we're going to proceed without him. Today on the agenda, we have a briefing on the sewer extension needs for unserved and underserved neighborhoods, an amendment to the 2018 to 2027 10-year comprehensive water supply and sewerage, and discussion on the 2022 to 2031 10-year comprehensive water supply and sewerage systems plan. 3 items. Councilmember Reamer, any opening remarks? Nope. Okay, great. I'll turn it over to our very able committee lead, Keith Levchenko, thank you for your great packet. Take it away.
Thank you. Our first item on the agenda today is a briefing, as you mentioned, on the Bi-County Infrastructure Workgroup report on sewer extension needs for unserved and underserved neighborhoods. We have Joe Beach, Deputy General Manager of Administration for Wssc Water here, who is also the chair of the work group. And we also have Jay Sakai. He was the consultant that assisted us. You may remember him from his days working at the state. And he helped greatly with the development of the report. We are very happy to be briefing the committee on this report today. The Wssc Water Commissioners were briefed late last year, and the Prince George's Council was briefed earlier this year, and both groups expressed support for this the concepts you're going to be hearing today, and so we are anxious to get it before this council and begin to move forward with implementation. And as you'll see from the presentation, the impetus for this was that the current system just was not working. You'll hear a lot more about that, primarily because of substantial costs that are incurred by a property owner seeking to extend a service to their property. And the report will provide some solutions to that issue. I'll also note that, and I mentioned this in item number 3, the 10-year plan, that the new approach does involve the creation of sub-districts and subsidies, and this does provide an opportunity in terms of prioritization down the line to consider racial equity and social justice impacts in the context of how this process would move forward. So I just wanted to note that it's mentioned in the report, but a lot of those details would have to be worked out later, so we can talk more about that. But with that, I'll turn it over to Joe Beach and his folks to lead us through the presentation.
Thank you, Keith. And good afternoon, council members. Good to see you again. Okay, so the recommendations of the work group, as you're going to see, as I'm sure you know already, this is a complex subject matter, involves land use and planning, public financing, especially public financing for low-income communities as well, engineering considerations, especially when you're coming up with the cost estimate on an extension, and then the requirements of state law. Another thing by way of introduction is the recommendations here are the work group recommendations. It's not a Wssc Water recommendation or a county government recommendation. That's sort of the consensus that the work group came to after a few years of working together, going through these issues. And one other thing is the scope of this report is on sewer extensions. We did not include water extensions because it's really not as much of an issue as we've seen with sewer extensions come up much more frequently. Next slide. And the next slide after that, Keith. So here's sort of the update of the work group recommendations. Keith briefed you on most of this. We have briefed the commission already in late 2021. The Prince George's County Council did pass a resolution earlier this year in support of the recommendations. We've briefed the Maryland Building Industry Association back in January of this year, and we've developed a proposed implementation plan for the work group recommendations. Wanted to mention that it did take a while for us to come up with these recommendations. One of the things that we had to struggle with, the existing state law. And the requirements of existing state law, and that it's the financing of these extensions is already built into the public utilities article. And that's why we have our general counsel, Amanda Kahn, here in case there are any sort of issues that come up about existing law. And the public utilities article, there were amendments made in the mid-90s that placed the responsibility for these extensions completely on the property owners. This policy change was successful in that it was addressing a debt issue with Wssc Water at the time. Debt had increased to over 50% of our operating budget because of the cost of financing these extensions. That was a risk not only to us, but to the county governments as well, and to their own bond rating. And so this has been very successful in that way. It got our debt below 40%, well into the, right now it's mid to upper 30%, below the level that the council has sort of defined in our spend and affordability guidelines as a threshold we shouldn't go beyond. However, there have been very few extensions financed since that time because of the affordability issues. And there were two work groups before that met to try to resolve these issues of affordability. One was in 2006, one was in 2014. It failed to get traction, and so this is the third attempt to sort of address this issue as well. Next slide. Just very briefly, on the working group membership, we had representatives from both county governments, from the executive and the legislative branch, about 14 staff from both counties. And as Keith mentioned, we had the assistance of Jay Sakai of Four Tenants Consulting. And it took about, frankly, 3 years. So there's a lot of energy, a lot of good expertise and patience that went into this report. We're very appreciative of that. Next slide. So there's about 4,000 septics in both counties, about 2,100 in Prince George's, about 1,700 in Montgomery County, where we've categorized those as either unserved or underserved. In both cases, they are using on-site disposal systems. We did adopt, for the purposes of the report, the definition of the Prince George's County Health Department's definition for unserved and underserved. An unserved community is defined as an area within the sewer service envelope where a new sewer main greater than 1,500 feet is required to extend sewer service to the homes within the area. An underserved community is defined as an area within the sewer service envelope where public sewer service is available to some homes within the community, but one or more houses cannot access the service until a new service main greater than 200 feet is built. So for the purpose of the legislation we're drafting now, so we don't get into these distinctions, we're just going to call it underserved, and that would cover both situations. And as Keith mentioned, as you've seen before, the costs it's really an affordability issue to finance these extensions. We have some illustrations that will show that later in the report. Next slide, please. So the current approach to financing is in the Maryland Annotated Code of the Public Utilities Article, Section 25-204 and 25-207. We do charge a front foot benefit charge for this of $6 per foot per year. And there's also, for whatever project costs are not covered by the front foot benefit charge, there's a project deficit charge that the property owner is responsible for as well. And then further, there also, that is, the property owner is responsible for any on-site plumbing, the septic system abandonment, application and inspection fees, and sewer connection from the house to the main. And we'll show you some illustrations later about what that all can amount to.
Joe, excuse me, just a quick question from Councilmember.
Front foot, what is the front foot again?
Front foot is just a method of assessing a benefit to a property owner provided by the government. And so you look at the frontage for the property, and an amount is assessed, like in this case, $6 per foot per year, in order to recoup from the property owner who's benefiting from the improvement the fees to pay for the improvement.
So it's a method of financing the extension? Or
exactly, yes.
By charging the property owner 6 feet per foot of pipe that is being added?
No, for
or
the frontage of your property.
The frontage of your property. So if you have a narrow property, it's really deep. Okay.
Well, yes, it gets a little more complicated than that because
Okay.
it has to be proportionate to the benefit that you received from the infrastructure, and there's some
I see.
interesting case law on that where you had some irregular sized parcels, and the property owners litigated what the charge was.
Okay.
Because the extent of the frontage was sort of out of proportion to the rest of the property and the benefit that was provided.
Thanks.
Right, but a key point is that the front foot benefit charge does not right now come close to typically covering the cost of the extension. So you see what's called the project deficit charge, That's on top of the front foot benefit charge, and the applicant is responsible for that deficit charge in addition to the front foot benefit charge. So it adds up.
Next slide, please. So there is a WSSC water health hazard subsidy. It's $15,000 per property owner. Once it's certified by the local health department who issues a health hazard letter. However, the subsidy is reduced by the assessment returns for those properties, which really reduces the benefit that provides to the property owner. Next slide. So we've talked about affordability, the affordability problem. What this table here shows is based on the EPA, US EPA definition of water and sewer affordability, how that looks like in a couple of typical cases of a sewer extension. So you start with the median household income, and the US EPA for several years has defined that as 2% of the median household income. In the case of Montgomery County, at $108,820, based on the 5-year average from the ACS, that'd be about $2,176. Now, $551 is the average sewer charge for service annually for one of our customers. That leaves about $1,625 available then to finance annually the sewer extension. In Prince George's, it's a lower median household income of close to $85,000, so 2% of that would be $1,700. Take out the annual operating charge for sewer service, there's about $1,147 left for the extension. Now keep in mind, that's according to the US EPA definition of affordability. As you can imagine, coming up with another $1,600 or $1,100 per year would be, difficult for most property owners.
And do you have any data on the cost of an average extension?
Yes, it's about 694 feet per linear foot based on some actual. And so as you're going to see from a couple of examples we have, the cost is going to vary significantly how far that extension has to be
Sure.
to
Okay.
connect
You
them
have
to service.
examples.
Now, and that's the median income for our customer assistance program. It's 175% of the federal poverty level for most homes, unless there's one person who qualifies, who's, I believe, over 67, in which case it'd be 200% for seniors would be eligibility for our customer service programs. Next slide. So here's one of two examples of unserved and underserved communities. This is Treasure Cove, George Thorne Estates in Prince George's County. There's 47 properties with septic systems. Of course, it's in the sewer service envelope. Some of these systems are identified as failing or close to failing, and the sewer extension in this case would be about 4,900 linear feet to connect the residents in this community to sewer service. And as I mentioned, the size of the extension is very important. At an average construction amount of 694 per linear feet, and with 3,500 per lateral extension from the main to the home, the total cost would be about $3.5 million. So that's about $91,350 per property owner, and that's assuming all 47 affected properties participate in the financing. For WSSC Water, we're sort of unique again compared to other jurisdictions in Maryland. A property owner is not required to connect when there's when the water main is abutting to their home. As we understand it, most other Maryland jurisdictions, it's mandated to connect. In our case, it is not required to connect, and that can affect the affordability for each property owner.
And that's in state law?
I believe so, yes.
Your general counsel's nodding confidently.
And this would, so for this, $3.5 million would be the total cost of the extension. And with the limitation on affordability, this would require a deficit subsidy of about $3.2 million just for this community here. Next slide. This example is an underserved community, and this is Green Ridge Drive in Montgomery County, where there's 13 homes with septic systems, one designated health hazard, one undeveloped lot. It's, of course, within the sewer service envelope. The extension here would be 1,020 feet. So with the 694 per linear feet and the lateral costs, the total cost of this extension would be $756,000 or $72,000 per property owner. This would require a project subsidy of about $524,000 to align the annual payment to the EPA definition of affordability. Next slide.
Joe, do you mind us interrupting you with
No,
questions at all,
absolutely.
since we're a
Yeah.
small group today?
Yeah.
Maybe Alan could help with this, or you tell me, but what's our current definition of a designated health hazard? What do you need to see? And also, if you could talk about what a failing system is in Montgomery.
Alan Sukup with DEP. Our definition of a failed septic system is one that no longer handles the wastewater flow from the building, from the house, resulting in either a leakage to the lawn, to the yard, or a backup into the house. Now, another definition would include those that are what DPS refers to as failing downward. In other words, they're not being properly treated as the effluent flows through the soil, and the effluent may be flowing untreated into ground and surface water. That's a little harder to detect, obviously, but we always require confirmation of that finding from DPS.
Right. Sometimes it's easy for the neighbors to detect, right?
Right.
So my confusion, it always seems like a very strict definition, at least in Montgomery County, and I don't know how it's defined differently in Prince George's. But as long as I've been here, I've heard from homeowners who tell me about who are often, some are applying for an exception, some are not or can't afford to, but they've had sewage backing up sometimes on their lawn, sometimes often into their house, and they are not able, they're not classified as a failing system.
I'm not aware of any situation like that we would have said was not a fail, or DPS would have said is not a failing system. Sometimes property owners, when they encounter that kind of condition, will go to frequently pumping out their septic tank, basically almost using it as a holding tank. And that keeps the effluent from backing up into the house or discharging to the surface of the yard. But if DPS comes to us with a confirmation of a system that's failing in that manner, we would always treat it as a failing system.
Sure.
There's just not, oftentimes there's not much that we can do about it.
Right.
Because sewer is too far away. If a property has access to public sewer or close access to public sewer, we will work with them to try to make that connection feasible.
Right.
But if, in a case like this, if you need 1,200, 1,700 feet of new sewer extension to reach you, it's just not manageable. And so in those cases, DPS works with the property owner to try to come up with an interim solution. Maybe they can get one new drain field on their property. They may have to go to a holding tank.
Right. I didn't mean to imply that DEP wasn't treating them as a failing system. To be clear, we've heard testimony sitting in these chairs from homeowners going back to Glen Hills many years ago, and even in the last several years from homeowners who have told us that DPS doesn't categorize their system as a failing system, even when they've had sewage backing up into their homes.
That would surprise me.
Okay.
I'm not aware of any situation like that. If somebody has effluent backing up into their house, it's a failed system. Now, the solution may be not so much to install a whole new system. There could be a rather simple issue with a broken pipe, problems with the septic tank themselves, where the septic tank can be replaced. It doesn't always require us to go in and put in a brand new septic system or to provide public sewer.
Right.
And we rely on DPS to interpret those situations for us.
Right. But and that's all, to be clear, on DPS.
Yeah.
Not your division, you take
Yeah.
their recommendation. Right. Okay.
Right.
Sorry, Joe. Back to you, but no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we've got a sort of a hypothetical example here. This is a community with 14 improved properties on septic, including one with a documented health hazard and one unimproved property. We're assuming each property has a frontage of 100 feet. So that's sort of the setup for the next slide, which is what would the financing look like under current law for something like this? It's a little complicated, but keep in mind that's what property owners have to deal with when they are looking at an extension. So for this, with a 700-foot extension to the sewer main at $694 per foot, it'd be about $535,000 for construction costs. $176,000 would be generated by the front foot benefit charge of $6 per linear foot for each property owner. The health hazard subsidy for this 14 property owners would be at $225,000. That's great, but that would reduce the overall health subsidy from the front foot benefit income to about $48,600. So the project deficit is about $309,800, or a deficit of $22,129 per property owner, along with the one-time costs for the sewer connection, plumbing, septic system abandonment, system development charge of $15,550. The total cost of connection per property owner is close to $50,000. So this would have a funding gap compared to the affordability threshold of $1,625 of about $246,124. So one of the goals, as you'll see, of the work group was not only to make it more affordable, but make the financing a lot more transparent and easier to understand for property owners. And that's currently not what we have here in the system. Next slide. This graphic just sort of displays the comparison of the annual charge per property owner compared with the affordability level in each county, and you can see it exceeded in every case. And next slide. So in coming up with our recommendations, we defined 6 policy objectives that you see here. We wanted one that was financially sustainable. It was going to be a reliable, consistent source of funding over time, that it would be affordable for most property owners, with special circumstances and additional subsidies for households on low and fixed income. We wanted to consider equity, that every new sewer extension request, the cost must be weighed against the benefits to the community and the public at large. We wanted a more simple and transparent system. We wanted to prioritize public health in our recommendations and maximize community participation in order to make the extensions more affordable. Next slide. The work group came up with 8 consensus recommendations. First of all, to increase public subsidies for sewer extension projects in underserved and unserved communities, to implement a uniform, affordable cost for homeowners in underserved and unserved communities to connect to sewer service. We'll have to come back to that recommendation later. More research in case law and state laws indicated there is a problem with the uniform fee. We wanted to provide additional assistance with upfront costs for homeowners who are experiencing hardships, financial hardships, and establish a pay-as-you-go capital improvement program for these extensions. We didn't want to get back into the issue of increased debt and debt service for Wssc Water, which puts a burden on ratepayers. Next slide. We wanted to allocate the program funding equitably between both counties. The counties and Wssc Water would aggressively pursue state and federal funding for these extensions. And we wanted to establish a sub-district process to secure support within underserved and unserved communities for these sewer connection projects to make them more affordable for each homeowner. And each county would develop an approach to identify and prioritize communities with the greatest need for sewer extensions. So potential funding sources, we identified 3 potential funding sources, and of course a compromise of a combination. Want to go over the pros and cons of each one. First of all, the new Wssc Water Fee. The fee could be efficiently administered and allocated in a separate account for the dedicated purpose. We could include that in the quarterly or monthly bill for our customers. That would be the benefits of that. Some of the disadvantages is some existing customers may not support an additional fee that is collected for the benefit of non-customers, especially if they self-finance their own extensions. For the next one of Wssc Water rate increase, again, this could be efficiently administered in the bill. However, you'd have that issue with existing property owners who would not support paying for non-customers to participate. And I want to also mention that both a new fee and using the volumetric rate would require new state legislation to authorize these new forms of financing, because within the Public Utilities article, there's already an existing financing scheme. And then third would be a county general revenue subsidy from both counties. The consensus recommendation for the work group was to combine both new water, Wssc Water Fee and a county general revenue subsidy from both counties. In order to incentivize the counties to participate, we would only impose the charge in the county and use that funds for extensions if a matching fund was appropriated and dispersed from each county to Wssc Water for that purpose. Next slide.
Joe?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, quick question.
Could you go back? You had mentioned that in other counties in the state, property owners are required to connect. How is that relevant, or how would that be applied in this circumstance? Is it when the property is first built, or is it in a day like today, like in any of these examples? You just turned your mic off. Joe, yeah.
No, the example we thought of was when we were doing a sewer extension and they were abutting that new sewer extension, that that's when they would be required. You could, of course, make it a requirement for any development within the sewer envelope as well.
Okay.
But there are,
In other words, the cases that you've provided us as your examples don't have an abutting
That's correct.
main, so it's not relevant per se, wouldn't have.
No, it's only when we would make the extension.
That's right. Once you make the extension, so that's actually an unsolved problem in this situation. Is we might proceed, let's say we agree, and then you want to proceed with some of these, but then some property owners might say, "Well, I don't want to,"
Exactly.
because they still have to pay the front foot charge.
Well, they could be assessed to them.
It'd be crazy to turn it down.
We do have the authority to, even if they don't connect, to levy the front foot benefit charge on them. I believe our practice has been not to do that. Of course, you're going to have the same problem with a property owner who feels like they have a operating septic. They don't want to connect to the system. Why should they be charged? Why should they be forced to connect?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, one thing we're looking with regard to that, and there's pros and cons, and we've talked a lot about this in the work group. If you compel people to connect when the extension comes, if they're in a sub-district environment, they may be less likely to support the concept of creating a sub-district, because they would be forcing themselves to do something they don't want to do. Another approach that we've discussed, and once again, pros and cons, is you may assess what that property will pay, but they don't have to pay until they connect at some time in the future, and you may determine when they have to connect, or if there's a change in property ownership, they connect, or something like that. That means that the counties or Wssc Water would have to float that cost over time, but it does mean you're probably going to have better better relations with those folks in the community that don't want to be compelled to connect immediately. So that's a tension we have not solved yet, and I think that's something that both counties can consider when they're developing their sub-district regulations. What exactly is required of the property owner who is in that sub-district?
Joe, in your list of, in the brainstorm potential funding sources, obviously you suggested county general revenue subsidies from both counties. Why isn't the state on here as a revenue source?
Definitely the state would be considered, and especially with jurisdictions in certain areas, the priority funding areas, there would be availability for state aid. I think Jay Sakai could speak to that. Jay goes somewhere.
Sorry. Good afternoon, Jay Sakai, 410s Consulting. I think it's a difficult issue with respect to calculating how much potential state money might be brought to bear. We did use an analysis that included as you know, the Bay Restoration Fund is a potential source of money for failing septic systems. The challenge lies in, getting entire communities to get together and agree to sponsor a project. You approach the state and request money for the project. The other challenge is the money is awarded competitively on a year-by-year basis. So I think for the purpose of the policy development, we were careful not to assume the presence of state money, but we're certainly intending to, in each and every case, apply for as much state funding as you could possibly get. That would help offset much of the costs. The state currently, under current law, can provide up to $20,000 per property if a BRF, Bay Restoration Fund grant is awarded. But that requires a certain criteria at the state level to be met. Sure. Has to be priority funding area, has to be generally as competitive with failing first. So we couldn't count on it, but it is an assumption that we included in the financial analysis.
Right, it's just not mentioned on slide 17, though. I mean, you can't count on county money, you can't count on WSSC ratepayer money either. This is all a brainstorm, right?
Yes, and it was a specific recommendation in the final report. It's identified as maximize state funding, potential state and federal funding for these projects.
Right, that was my next question about federal funding as well. But in terms of the question of responsibility, WSSC is created by the state. So to leave them off the brainstorm of potential revenue sources, to me, that's where you would start, presupposing we try to get as much federal funding as well. And then, if there's additional money needed, then you talk about the county and the ratepayers. But anyway, I've said my piece. Mr. Beach, thank you.
Next slide. So the work group did come up with a sort of roadmap to improve the system of financing. As you can see here, we've got identify sources of funding, establish the sub-district process, define homeowners' contributions, identify additional assistance for low-income homeowners, those who would qualify for our customer assistance program, and establish sub-district rules and regulations. Like a lot of these things, it would be a partnership with WSSC and the county governments, but for a lot of those things, a lot of these steps would be the county government would be in the lead on these issues. And the next slide on our proposed implementation plan, we need to identify the potential target communities that would be potential candidates for the extensions, develop a process to define sewer service subdistricts within these target communities, identify sources of funding to increase the public subsidies. And right now we are drafting legislation we'd like to present later this month to our delegations for the 2023 General Assembly session. Task 4 would be to develop and promulgate program rules and regulations, and to initiate a pilot program to refine how the project planning and project execution phases will be coordinated between WSSC and the county governments and the state when we're able to obtain state funding. So last slide, just in conclusion, this is a growing public health problem in both underserved and unserved communities. The current approach is just not working. It's not affordable, and additional public subsidies are needed. And it is a complex problem. It's going to take a few years to work through all of these issues and have a sustainable new financing arrangement in place. And our current fiscal challenges are just another complication, but we're definitely willing to work with the county governments to bring about an ongoing sort of resolution to this issue. So that's our recommendations. We can take any more questions that the committee has.
Keith, anything to add? Or Steve or Alan?
Yeah, and you've got a sense here of all the other things that need to happen at the local level. At our local level here, the sub-district process, that likely would be regulatory. There might be some element of that in the 10-year water and sewer plan, but the details would probably be done through regulation, which would then come to the council for discussion. In terms of county sources of revenue, I think we could probably allocate general funds without any change in legislation. If we were looking at our water quality protection charge, though, for instance, as a possible revenue source, and there may be a nexus there with improving our water quality issues, especially in environmental areas, that may require legislation to enable us to use that fund for this purpose. So things like that need to be worked out. I think DEP and DPS have a pretty good sense of the communities that we would look at and begin to identify as potential subdistricts. But you have the whole subdistrict process. You're familiar with subdistricts in other realms, sidewalks, noise barriers, trash collection, things like that. But this is, once again, another issue that would require all the details of petition process and how you define the area, and as I mentioned earlier, who pays and when. Those would all have to be worked out through a regulatory scheme that would then be promulgated by the executive and then approved by the council. So a lot more work to come with this.
Since you mentioned the executive, what's been the feedback from the executive branch?
Yeah, the executive supports the recommendations and the possibility of a new charge where the county would put some money into it.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Chairman?
So I don't pretend to be an expert on water and sewer policy, but I'm more than an interested observer because we see these water and sewer category changes, and I've been through a number of controversial neighborhood dust-ups over extensions. And I would just observe that none of this is really objectionable on its face, but I'm a little bit concerned, and the planning board wanted to transmit comments because we're all concerned about backing up and taking a look at what is the implication, first of all, of establishing policies that may invite additional requests for extensions other than the ones that we all know about, the ones that are either on some kind of provisional status or there's some special master plan recommendation like Glen Hills, or in the case, I can think of properties in places like Sandy Spring and the northeastern part of the county where people are very attuned to the equity implications of this. And I'm talking about issues that go beyond just equity in the sense that's been discussed so far today. I could envision property owners who are not currently served who will be raising their hand and saying, hey, we may be outside the envelope, but it's really a matter of equity because of the racial justice elements that are involved, the socioeconomic status of the property owners involved, and will be very hard, it'll be difficult to draw a line based on the previous, the sort of legacy ideas about where the envelope should be established. The second part that I think needs to be thought through as part of this policy is, there's this idea that this is similar to things like petitioning for a sidewalk in a neighborhood. It is similar in some respects, but usually when you have sidewalk construction or the like, it's a question of, is there consensus in the neighborhood that there should be a sidewalk? That can be difficult enough. In this case, you may have properties that that can demonstrate a public health threat because they have a failing septic system, although there may be debate over what is failing. As we saw with Glen Hills, that can be hotly contested. But even assuming we can agree that there are properties where the septic system is failing, I think some of the examples you've been shown are in neighborhoods where there perhaps already is consensus that everybody wants to connect. In some neighborhoods, you're going to find neighbors that don't want to connect, and yet their property will be passed by an extension to somebody who has demonstrated a public health threat. So then the question will become, on what terms can that property owner hook up or pay, and when will they be obligated to pay? Similarly, you will have properties that by design, as part of the master plan, in what you might consider a too clever by half maneuver that was undertaken many years ago to limit growth, there's been master plan recommendations that say you shouldn't be allowed to connect to the public water and sewer system as an effort to effectively limit the development capacity of land beyond what's required by the zoning code. And so we have seen properties in some neighborhoods like Glen Hills that don't have a public health problem. In fact, they don't have any house on them right now, but they, property owners who are in the neighborhood see an opportunity. If their neighbor is going to ask for a sewer extension in order to deal with a failing septic system, they say, well, this looks like a great opportunity for me to finally be able to develop this property that was previously undevelopable, if only we could get sewer service extended to my lot. And so that will raise questions about, should the government be subsidizing sewer extensions to properties that have no development on them currently, in order to basically increase the market value of their property. And the market value of their property may effectively increase by more than the amount that they're going to be expected to pay. So the government would essentially be subsidizing adding development potential to individual lots. And some of these will be in neighborhoods that are not equity focus areas. They will be neighborhoods with highly affluent people who could be the beneficiaries of public subsidies that are operating to their advantage when they bought their property with no expectation that they would ever be able to develop anything there. So I'm not here to try to resolve that, and as I say, it's kind of not really my speciality or the planning board's area of focus necessarily, but we are sort of bystanders to it, and I felt that it was important because we've seen a number of these cases come through the process at various times over my tenure, and things that come before the board, that I thought it was important to raise those questions and try to surface them before people start thinking too much about, the admittedly important, in not just sympathetic cases, but the ones where we do identify a public health problem or similar urgent need to address, that we be careful not to create open-ended invitations for requests for service that may invite more demands on public funds or ratepayer funds.
But at this point, you don't have amended recommendations or anything like that?
Well, only that some of those considerations, I think, should be overlaid on top of some of the things that have been discussed today, because of course these folks have spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it's all unimpeachable as far as it goes. But my suggestion to you, and the planning board's suggestion, is that those issues should be addressed at the time these changes are made, as opposed to making these changes to address the problems that are staring everybody in the face, and then hoping that it doesn't come back to bite us, months, years, decades down the road. So that's my modest suggestion.
Are you sending over recommendations?
Only what we said in the staff report, but we would be happy to. I think our staff and others may have some ideas about how to operationalize that. For example, a clear standard on what happens when a property owner is passed by new service. Do they have to join in or not? Are they eligible for a subsidy if they elect to say no when service is established and later they want to connect? What will the principle be that governs when and if you have to pay, and if you opt in or opt out, are you going to be treated differently? That seems to me to be one of the basic issues, and also just maybe an understanding by everybody involved, particularly council. Is there a ceiling on the total amount of the subsidy? I mean, of course, WSSC is concerned about its debt service obligations. I understand they have quite a backlog of water and sewer pipes that have to be upgraded just because they're aging, and if that compounds the challenges of footing the bill to refurbish these systems that were installed in some cases close to 100 years ago, that just seems like that would aggravate the problem, and I'm just arguing to get in front of that.
Thanks. Councilmember Bramer.
Thanks. Definitely your comments brought to mind lots of questions, but one thing that was just in the back of my mind as we were talking is there a mechanism for the county to recoup a general subsidy, through the sale of the property? And is that something that whenever the property changes hands, as you said, Keith, I think, or maybe it was Joe, but eyeballing it, it sounds to me like the property value would increase at least as much as the cost of that hookup. It's just that the homeowner can't necessarily afford that. But yeah, we would be financing a significant windfall to some extent.
Yeah, and the group talked a lot over the past the three work groups that Joe mentioned. What is an appropriate subsidy to provide, and how do you means test it appropriately? As you mentioned, could a lien process be one option? Maybe, but I think this group saw a lot of complications with that down the line. So I think the group settled on making these extensions affordable. Folks would still have to pay a significant out-of-pocket amount to connect, but that would be capped at some level. Once again, some of these details need to be worked out. But there would be a there would be a homeowner responsibility, and there would be a county responsibility, since there is a county benefit to these properties within the planned service area being connected over time. That you're providing an incentive for folks to transition from an on-site system that may or may not be failing, we may not know, to a system that should be nearby, but for an accident of geography perhaps, is not nearby their particular home within the planned service area. But it's a difficult issue. I think the affordability piece is incredibly challenging here, and as was mentioned earlier, when does someone pay? How do they pay? There are pros and cons to all those elements. There's no right answer here. So I think this group tried to identify a system that was also easy to understand, simple, would lead to more connections with the properties that we want to connect, still provide a responsibility to the homeowner for a significant cost, both the on-site costs that they would still be responsible for, all the fees they're responsible for, as well as the extension costs, which would be subsidized to some degree. So it's a very difficult puzzle to put together.
Well, I can only imagine, I guess, just keep thinking on these things, and there should be some option, I feel like, where the homeowner isn't responsible for as much, but has the option of allowing that funding to be repaid to the county, or allowing the county to recapture the expenditure, so that you don't end up in a situation where it's only the more affluent areas that can afford to connect. So, okay.
Is there any role of our health staff in assessing risk from failing systems? I haven't ever seen them in any of these briefings.
So, a rule?
I'm guessing I know the no, a role.
Oh, a role. Again, we have a responsibility in the water and sewer plan to work with DPS to address systems that are failing or near failing. Near failing would be the kind of situation I discussed before, where the property owner is intervening, but there is no permanent resolution to the problem. They may be pumping their tank out on a much more frequent basis than is normal. We have a role to try to address those situations with DPS, both on an individual basis and on an area-wide basis, which, as you may recall, received a lot of discussion in the last update of the water and sewer plan. So there is now a requirement in the plan that if we're looking at an area that is a potential survey area for septic systems, there has to be at least one existing failing system as documented by DPS. And DPS also has to confirm that there is no reasonable on-site repair or replacement of that failing system, short of a holding tank.
Sure.
And the state does mandate that in the water and sewer regulations. And in the past, we've had, I think, a lot of success with addressing those failures until the mid-90s, when the financing situation changed. And within a relatively short time, within a few years, it became very difficult for property owners to afford the kinds of extensions that were needed to resolve their problems. And so that left them with trying to come up with an on-site solution that does not completely satisfy state and county standards and affects what they can do with their property. They can't add a bedroom on, they can't rebuild the house, so on and so forth. So again, the emphasis on this process is, one, for properties within the planned service envelope, which I think we can define pretty well, and to make something that's affordable for the typical property owner, because right now it's not.
No, yes. I mean, the equity questions are obvious enough, even to me. But it just strikes me, going back to hearings on this, Glen Hills years ago, and some of the testimony that stuck with me the most was the health effects we heard about from people, elderly folks, people with compromised immune systems, others. I've sat in, I don't know how many of these hearings over the years, and looking at like the members of your working group, it's always approached only as an infrastructure and planning an infrastructure problem to be solved, and not as I don't see any of us getting advice from public health professionals, is all I'm just noting for the record. That I hadn't really thought about before this, but they're not, those recommendations aren't here, they're not part of the working group, et cetera. So.
Well, the Well and Septic Office does provide us with recommendations. Now, our system is different than in most counties because our well and septic planning, if you will, and permitting is within the Department of Permitting Services, not within the Health Department.
Yes.
And actually, we had a member of the Prince George's County Health Department on our team looking at this issue. So we did get a lot of feedback on what the potential health implications for these problems are. We don't, unfortunately, the water and sewer plan, we really have to look at it from primarily a infrastructure standpoint. And we rely on DPS to let us know what the health implications are, and any coordination they need to do with the health department is done at their level.
At their level, right,
Yep.
and they're not really health experts. Okay, great. All right, I think we're well briefed at this point. Keith, are there actions?
Well, I think in terms of the next steps for the committee, based on today's conversation, we may look at the 10-year plan, that's also item 3 today.
Right.
And prior to that going to the full council, we may want to look at the language we include regarding this. There is some language already in the plan about this issue. So we staff may suggest some edits to that down the line, perhaps at the October meeting that we have. And we may, at some point, want to consider whether we want a similar briefing for the full council, the next council, that will have to deal with this issue.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's going to be coming back in different elements. A lot of the details we talked about would have to come back in a regulatory process in terms of the creation of subdistricts. So that's going to have its own process for the next council.
Right. Okay. I just remembered one last question I had. So simultaneous with the process that you've gone through with the working group, Joe, there have been these meetings of the Maryland Advisory Commission to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that resulted in the study they just kicked out on water affordability in Maryland that raised all kinds of equity issues about mostly water rates. But I don't know that they considered this issue at all, but it almost seems like that advisory committee ought to be consulted about how they would approach this problem as well, since this has a lot to do with ensuring clean water for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Surface water and drinking water,
Yeah.
right. I assume I'm right that they weren't part of the working group or in any meetings or any of that?
No, they weren't, and I did review a summary of their recommendations, but I can go back to that and see if we can get the review and comments on this.
Great.
A couple of things I did neglect to mention that our chair, Fausto Bayonet, is here. Want to
Yes,
acknowledge
thank you
the
very
chair.
much. Mr. Chairman, for being here.
And just not related to this, but want to let you know, we have deployed a team through the federal government to Jackson, Mississippi, of about 6 of our operators,
Great.
maintenance folks to sort of help out there. They're going to be there over the next, I believe, 9 days, helping them.
Do you have anything to share about what they're doing?
I can give you a briefing once, but they're helping them basically run the water plant, identify sort of, process and infrastructure corrections and recommendations that they can make. But it's mainly, I think, helping them out in the short term operationally and running their plant.
Right. There are 6 more hands, 6 extra sets of hands. You reminded me, speaking of other jurisdictions, of I didn't see in the deck consideration of what other jurisdictions, how other states are tackling these connection charges and the equity implications.
Yeah, within the report, we actually mentioned what Anne Arundel County does, what Baltimore County does, and what
Okay.
Howard County does as well. And they all treat it somewhat differently, but they all struggle, and they all struggle with the same issues that we are. I know Anne Arundel County in particular is working through this right now. A couple of conferences I've been through, I know Miami-Dade has similar issues, and a lot of jurisdictions, it's not just us,
Right.
have the same affordability issues.
Is there any, from the federal government or anybody else, trade associations, national best practices on this and how to
Not
tackle
that
it?
I'm aware
This
of.
is a big sweeping legacy challenge for everybody, right?
It is, and I think one of the reasons that there isn't a best practice recommendations are just the challenges that we're seeing here, that were identified by the planning board chair. It's a very complicated issue, and there's no easy solutions to it, because it's very fact-based. By community, it varies.
Okay, we're counting on the planning chair to bring us some easy solutions. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Levchenko. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Mr. Chairman, for joining us. Mr. Chairman, for joining us. And everybody from DEP and WSSC. Thanks so much.
Great job.
Thanks, Jay.
Our next item, we have a category change request. Let folks come and go from the table. All right, so the current request we have before us actually came from the executive this past January. The applicant's name is Mohebi, so that's you'll see it's 21-TRV-03A with the applicant Mohebi. So that's the way to sort of categorize this one. The executive recommended deferral of the request. We'll discuss that in a little more detail. The planning board at its March 31st meeting had recommended denial of the request, and we'll get into that. And the council last took up this item at a public hearing on April 19th. So from that time frame, you can see that it's been at the council for a while. Much of that is because we were going through a budget process, and most items that were not directly budget related were pushed out to beyond budget. So this item has been sitting longer than category changes typically do sit at the council. The request itself involves a oddly shaped 5.17 acre RE2 zoned property on Centurion Way near McCrossin Lane and Trevilla Road in Potomac. I'm going to try to bring up a picture of this for you. Let's see if I have it here. Yeah, I'm bringing up the packet. The packet does have a map on, let's bring it up here. Here it is. It's on circle page 11 of the packet, and I've just brought it up on the screen. You can get some of it on here. So on the screen you can see the property in question has a southern element to it and then a pipe stem extending to a northern portion of the property. The home itself, the existing home, is on the northern portion of the property. The septic system that serves the property is on the southern piece of the property. And then you can see south of the property you have existing sewer service within the Palatine area of Potomac. And according to Wssc Water, that low-pressure sewer main that I just referenced down here near this circle could serve this property. It would require about a 70-foot extension to serve that southern portion of the property. If it were to extend to the northern piece, or way up here, it would be about a 700-foot extension going along Centurion Drive, or Centurion Way, up towards the northern piece. Now, in terms of policy issues regarding this request, the property is outside the planned sewer envelope, and therefore, as you're well aware, the County Water and Sewer Plan has some limited exceptions to consider providing service in certain cases. The most common of these are to address failed septic systems. While the applicant has noted some issues they've had with their septic system, we do not have a documented failed system in this case. So unless DEP staff knows something new on this issue, we don't have that as a policy issue here. Also, the abutting mains policy, another common way that properties on the edge of the envelope may be eligible to connect. Once again, in this case, the property would require about a 70-foot extension at the least. It does not abut the property currently. And then the third way, which is specific to the Potomac subregion area, is the peripheral sewer service policy. That allows properties that are adjacent or confronting the planned sewer envelope to be eligible to connect under certain conditions. However, the 2002 Potomac Subregion Master Plan has certain exclusions in it, and one of the exclusions is for properties that are adjacent to or in the vicinity of the Palatine subdivision, which this property is. So under those criteria, both the master plan from 2002 and the water and sewer plan, which has basically implemented those policies in the master plan, we don't have a exceptional service policy that would allow approval of this request under our current plans. Now, with that said, the executive did not recommend denial of this request outright. The executive recommends deferral of the request and recommends further review of the policy justification and technical limitations for the Palatine exclusion in the peripheral sewer policy. Basically, and we have DEP staff here that can speak to this, the 2002 master plan referenced or included this exclusion, according to DEP staff, for feasibility reasons in terms of the capacity of the system to be able to serve other properties. However, there have been improvements to this system over time, over the last 20 years. And when DEP approached Wssc Water with this request this time around in terms of capacity, Wssc indicated there was the potential to serve this property with that extension that I had mentioned earlier. However, it does raise the policy question. This is not the only property, obviously, that could potentially be eligible if we were to change this policy. So we have this policy issue. We have questions about what could be served in the future, this property versus others. And since we have the 10-year water and sewer plan before us now, this policy could be considered in the context of the 10-year water and sewer plan. So we have a bit of a chicken and the egg problem with this. If the committee is interested in further pursuit of this, there's sort of some informational work that needs to be done to identify what really can be served by this and what are the implications for other properties. I've noted in the packet the other properties in the area that if you were to do these extensions like you would for this property, you're talking about a couple dozen or more properties that could be affected. So that's a significant change or significant exception to be made. So we'd want to be very careful with that. On the other hand, we have the 10-year plan before us, so we have a unique opportunity to look at this now. The other thing I'll mention is, and this carries over with some other requests we'll talk about in item 3, the Potomac Subregion Master Plan is 20 years old, and at some point the council should consider revisiting that plan. In fact, the council had suggested just that when it was reviewing the Glen Hills policy issues about 5 or 6 years ago. And the resolution that approved some changes in the Glen Hills policy also recommended a limited master plan amendment to look at septic and sewer issues in Glen Hills. If the master plan were to be revisited in some limited way, looking at water and sewer issues, this is one of those issues that could also be looked at in that context. So you have those two avenues that you could pursue. You've got the 10-year plan that's before us now, and you've got the master plan, which if reopened would provide an opportunity for that as well. But right now, staff is suggesting holding off on this until we go through the 10-year plan update, see where the committee is on that policy issue, and deciding at that point which avenue to take to go forward with this request.
DP, anything to add? You could, anything to add from you?
The deferral could work either way. It could work with the plan or without the plan. Our intention was to take this stepwise, and our first step in this would be to consult with WSSC on the feasibility of serving other properties in the area around Palatine. As Keith mentioned, back in 2002, this recommendation, or this policy recommendation in the master plan, was primarily moved forward by limitations of capacity in the Palatine low-pressure system. At the time, WSSC told us that we simply could not accept any additional connections into that system. With some upgrades to the sewer lines there, obviously WSSC, in this particular case, told us that they could serve the property, which is a change from where we were 20 years ago. And so our first step in this is to bring this before the council and say, do you want us to pursue this with WSSC at all?
Yeah.
If you do, we can defer it. If not, then the logical step would simply to be deny the request and not pursue the issue, the policy issue and the capacity issue any further.
Sure.
I'd like to proceed with the plan and allow us to consider the request. I would not deny the request at this stage. I think it would be helpful to have a policy framework that thinks it through. So, it's let's move forward, but do it the right way, I guess.
And again, Keith is right. This is not just a capacity issue that we're dealing with. There is a policy recommendation in the 2002 master plan that if we want to change the way things work here, we may need to go back in and revisit that in the master plan process. Ouch.
Personally, I see this applicant as having incurred, a lot of costs from what I think most of us, common sense, would define as a failing system from everything I've learned about this. He's waited a long time for relief. It seems more severe than other exceptions that we've made, in previous years. And we know WSSC has said the system has additional capacity now and could serve this property. I, agree with the need to update the 10-year plan, but to me, I don't necessarily see the benefit of deferral in this one case, because I think that's sort of superseded with the need to provide some relief and solve the problem. Regardless of what sort of precedent it might set for other properties, we draw distinctions like that all the time. That's just what we do. So my preference would be to grant this, but there's only two of us today. Yeah.
Well, I think the committee would benefit from perhaps some more information on the feasibility of serving this and other properties. But I guess
what kind of information? I thought WSSC had said it was feasible. That's in the report.
To serve this property, not necessarily the broader implications, if you will.
Yes.
Right, but that's the item in front of us. Did you want more information on the failures of this property itself? That's what I thought you were going to say.
Well, that's also
Mr.
part of it.
Moheby's here, and
Yeah.
he's
We don't, right now, this
Document
request is
progress.
not coming in as a failed system with DPS having.
That's where I was going earlier, is I
Yeah.
think we've heard from a lot of constituents. I would never, if I had one of these systems, never want to undergo what they have had to put up with in systems that often are not deemed failing. Not to mention it's sort of not a preventive way toward to approach public policy, but everything I've heard from many individual homeowners seems to be that our definition of failing systems, DPS's definition, is quite
Right.
strict, unreasonably strict.
Right. And that may be the case, that down the line, the system reaches that threshold where it could be considered a failure, and then it could go through an expedited process. Without that, I think we are left with this peripheral sewer policy issue. If the committee was supportive of being able to move forward with this type of request, then we would need to fashion some revised language that treats it a little bit more on a case-by-case basis. And I could try to work with DEP on that, that would allow this to move forward the way the committee wants to. We could bring that back at the October meeting and see if that, accomplishes what the committee wants. But short of having a documented failure, which is a very easy process once you've done that, or a very, very straightforward process, at least, we just have this policy issue that we have to address. So we can try to craft some language that may accomplish sort of what the committee wants to do, without opening up the broader issues which we don't know about yet, without further discussion with WSSC. So that's amenable to the committee.
Yeah.
I can try to work on some language.
Is that fine? Yeah. Okay.
All right.
How long would that kind of language take? Because there'll still need to be the approval by the state, right?
Well, yeah, regardless of anything we do, any change to the plan goes to the Maryland Department of the Environment
Right.
for final approval.
Yep.
Anything before that time is tentative and subject to
Sure.
disapproval by the state. So that goes for any changes that we'll be talking about here.
Sure. But the workload, just in terms of workload, the language won't take long to come up.
No, I think the language, and once again, as staff, I'm not absolutely sure whether I can come up with something that I personally would recommend. But
Sure.
I think I can come up with language that gets to where the committee wants to be, that we can talk about on the 3rd.
Okay, great.
And I see Alan shaking his head there, so I'll take that as he can help, kind of
Nodding,
nod.
not
Yes.
shaking.
It's a challenge we look forward to.
Yes. Love to hear that. Thank you. Good.
All right, so our
Item 3.
third item today is the 10-year water and sewer plan update. Just a few general points, very important to note here. State law does require that jurisdictions update their plans, both their water and sewer plans, and by the way, their solid waste plans. Same law, same part of the law, every 3 years. We are actually in the 4th year of this, but given circumstances over the past couple of years, I think we're actually doing pretty well given the pandemic over the past 2.5 years. Also, it's important to note, and both of you were here for the 2018 update. The 2018 update was after about 15 years of no comprehensive update. We had other limited updates to the plan over time, significant, but we had not done a full comprehensive update in many years until 2018. So we are still relatively early in the next cycle for this. Another key point to note is that given that we are in an election year, the 10-year plan does have language that explicitly precludes any review or action of a water and sewer plan amendment or update after October 31st of this year. Therefore, the council would need to act before that time, or in our case, October 25th is the last Tuesday in October, so that's the date we would need to target to get committee recommendations to the council for a work session and action. As I mentioned earlier, we do have an October 3rd meeting on the calendar. So to the degree, whatever we don't get through today, we can bring back to the committee on the 3rd. After that, it gets very, very tight in terms of trying to schedule additional committee time and turn it around for a work session and action at the council. So just as a caution to the committee, as we go through this today, that we have that time frame before us. For today's meeting, I think it is important that we have DEP staff present the major changes that are recommended by the executive in the plan update. Staff has also identified other issues of interest to the council that may or may not be directly reflected in the executive's changes. So we will also talk about those. And based on that discussion today, the committee may be ready to support or straw vote, or at least a 2-0, on some of these issues. But any issues requiring further discussion, we do have the October 3rd meeting that we can come back to and hopefully get the committee ready for action on that date. The other thing I wanted to note, during the same time, over the next 6 weeks, the council is also reviewing and potentially approving the Thrive Montgomery plan. So a major component of that plan obviously is land use, and the impact that would flow into the water and sewer plan perhaps in different ways. So we don't know where that's going yet, so we'll have to see about that. Also, a major component of the review of the Thrive Montgomery plan is its racial equity and social justice review, that consultant report that you just received, and how those policies and practices might flow into our discussions later. So it's sort of a wait and see. We have to see where that goes. As I did note earlier, just while we're talking about racial equity and social justice, I mentioned earlier about the extension cost issue and the creation of subdistricts, and we talked a little bit about how there may be processes there that would be of interest in this review. So we will definitely take those up as part of that extension cost discussion later. But with that, I think I'll turn it over to Mr. Sukup and DEP to go over the major changes in the plan and see how much progress we can make today on it. So I'm going to bring up those slides. Let's see, not there. Here we go.
Okay. We do have a bit of background information in this presentation on the plan. You all have been here for a while, so I don't know that it's necessary to drag you through that again. If Councilmember Glass was here, I think we'd push to have that done, but we can give that to him at a separate time. Okay, Keith, take us to the changes.
You should probably do that too.
Would you like the background? We can do that.
No, provide it to Councilmember Glass.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
He'll be the only
And
continuing T&E member.
right, and then we fully expect to do a session like that for the new council members after December.
Yeah, we have typically in past years with new councils done orientation sessions on water and sewer planning, because most people do not come to the council with much knowledge of it.
And then they say, why did I want this job?
And yeah, it's just one more nuance of their job they didn't know about. Which page do you want to be on?
And there's kind of clues down there. There we go.
Okay.
New initiatives and critical policy revisions. We have, the water and sewer plan right now has a requirement that comes down to us from state law that says if your property is in the plan service envelope, category 1 or 3, and you now have access to an existing water sewer main, when your on-site facility fails, you have to connect to public service. And there's quite a bit of discussion of that. What we have found over the years is that, especially with new subdivisions going into large lot areas zoned for 1 and 2 acre development, those are frequently at a substantial distance from existing water and sewer mains. The area zoned for 1 and 2 acre development do not have the same kind of aerial constraints that smaller properties have. And so our recommendation in this plan is to, on a case-by-case basis, allow developers to secure an exception to the need to use public water or sewer in dealing with these kinds of low-density subdivisions. That follows along with some changes that we made to the plan back in 2018, and a general trend towards using, especially on-site septic, where it's acceptable to do so.
And I will note, we did not get any feedback either from the public or from the planning board opposing this change, and staff is comfortable with this change as well.
Okay. We have some changes recommended in the policy that addresses properties that abut existing or planned public mains. And this first case comes to us from a couple of category changes that the council looked at last year. And Keith, if you want to cruise down to the example, there we go. Okay. Actually, go to the next one, because that's the case that was involved here. We had 2 properties on Boswell Lane in Potomac. One, the property to the south, is owned by the Aurora family, and they qualify for a single connection to an abutting low-pressure main. And you can see the low-pressure main off to the west side of the property there. That's the line that's in red. It abuts their property, and they could connect to it now. And in fact, the council approved the connection for them when this case came forward. Now, what the Auroras have in addition requested is to be approved for a main extension that would bring the sewer line up in line with the existing house on the property, requiring less of an on-site pipe, if you will, to connect the house. The ability for them to do an extension is neither allowed or denied in the existing policy, in part because they're so expensive to build. Who would want to do that? However, in this case, if the Auroras were to build the extension proposed, which is about 140 feet, it has the potential to also serve the property on the north side of Boswell Lane, belonging to Mr. Kapoor. The Kapoors have pursued public sewer for many years now, and under a variety of options that they wanted the council to consider. This is the only one that, if there is a significant policy change in the water and sewer plan, would allow them to connect to public sewer, other than simply granting them an exception to do so. So we have a policy in the plan that allows for a property owner with an abutting main to pursue and get approval for a main extension that would better serve their property. That would also allow any property confronting that owner's property to also get service if the extension would put them in an abutting main situation. This policy change would allow the council to approve both of these properties, both the extension and the Kapoor property, for public sewer service. This is limited. We would limit the extension to the extent that it would come to where the house has its existing septic system. If you want to bounce back one, here's a theoretical example. So again, an extension that would come up to where the house is, or where the house's existing septic system is, not beyond at that point. And in this example as well, there is a property on the other side of the street that could make use of an abutting mains connection, whereas it does not qualify at this time. We would want to limit that perhaps to one property only. But we've put the bones of that policy in the draft plan for the council to consider.
And I will add, we did receive feedback from, in the public hearing from the West Montgomery County Citizens Association. They were concerned about a number of policies existing in the plan itself that allow service to be extended outside the plan envelope, but they also expressed concern about this particular change as just expanding upon a policy they're already concerned about. So we have that. The other thing I would note is, as Mr. Sukup mentioned, the main extensions are very expensive. We talked about that a little bit earlier with the main extension financing issue, and tend to be significantly more than the on-site connections are. So as he mentioned, the incentive is for properties to minimize any kind of main extension if they can, and live with whatever on-site connection they need to have. But the difference here is, if it opens up service to another property, in this case Kapoor, then you may have the potential in the future for properties to join together and say, all right, let's do a joint application, or I'll financially assist you in your application for a budding mains request that includes a main extension. So we just don't have I don't know if we have an easy way of knowing how many properties would sort of fall into that pattern. On its face, you wouldn't expect a lot of properties to pay more than they otherwise have to, but if it is opening up service to other properties, then that's a bit of a wild card we don't know about. One, and I've noted in the packet some of the issues here about how you determine how far the main extension can go. Mr. Sukup mentioned you bring it up to a logical point where it would cross to the home or to the existing on-site connection. What about whether properties that would then be abutting, if they are vacant or already have an existing home on them? Should that make a difference, perhaps, as to whether they would be eligible under this policy? If you require there to be an existing home, then you're at least limiting the impact of the original policy of being outside the envelope to basically getting what you can on septic and not being able to develop if not. If you've already developed on septic to some degree, then presumably the impact of then adding sewer later is a little bit less. You may still be able to expand on your property, but you're not going from a vacant property to a then developed property. So the impacts of this main extension approach would be maybe a little bit less. But like I said, it's difficult to know what the broader impacts of this would be. Go ahead.
What I can tell you is that when we first were charged with this policy issue, I went back and looked at all of the abutting mains approvals we have granted in the last 20, 25 years. And in virtually all of those cases, a main extension would not have made any difference. Either the main came to the property, to the house, or the main completely abutted the frontage of the property, so on and so forth. When you start to look further afield at potential sites, obviously there are some, because we found this one. And there are likely others, but it would take a more substantial amount of research to determine exactly what situations would apply here, how many cases we could run into.
Right, and the other issue that the council had some sympathy with regard to the Kapoor request was that in this particular case, he would be the last property on that block that could be served, or if not, would be the only property not served. So there was some issue, concern
Because the
about
others
fairness.
around are already served.
Right, the other properties in that area. Now, the history of the sewer extension in this area is checkered as well, because the initial approval was for a development, I guess, to the northwest.
Yeah, back up go down one slide. Yeah, there was a site here back in, I'm trying to remember, was it?
Early 2000s?
Early 2000s, I guess, yeah. And the council determined that, this is in the Piney Branch watershed, first off, so you've got all kinds of other things you have to deal with. the council determined that that site, which was proposed for a 4-lot subdivision on Boswell Lane, satisfied the intent of the Piney Branch service policy and granted an approval. The reason that you're not allowed to approve any water and sewer plan amendments or updates after October 31st is because of that approval. It occurred on the last day of the council session before the election. And so that's been questioned. It was initially denied by the state, but there were technicalities that allowed it to go forward. And so the reason that sewer is even this far down Boswell Lane is in part due to that approval. It's further along now because there have been septic failures. But every other property along Boswell Lane is either served or it can be approved for service under the abutting mains policy, which the Piney Branch system allows. So yes, Mr. Kapoor's property is the last property on this section of Boswell Lane that is in any way not eligible under existing policies for approval for public sewer.
So point us to the page here in the packet where the,
Well, in the packet itself, yeah, pages 5 and 6 talk about the limited extension issue. So I think as staff, we're trying to get a sense of, is the committee interested in this, in the executive's recommendation? Is there some further limitations they would be interested in? As staff, I've suggested some here, and we've talked about some. But it's a difficult issue because there was some sympathy for this specific request, but we don't really have a good sense of the broader implications. So we're in a bit of still in a discussion stage here. If the committee's interested, we can do a little bit more work on this and bring it back in October.
yeah, I vote for that. Okay.
But it's just a tough issue. All right, we'll bring that back.
Okay, back to slides. There we go. Another issue that came up in this last council packet that you all saw was the issue of the Inane property on Piney Meeting House Road. And you want to go down 3 slides, 2, 3. Yes, there we go. This is a case where the owners of the property that you see highlighted in yellow also own an outlot adjacent to them to the north. It's one of the properties highlighted in green, sort of. That outlot was part of a subdivision with the lot in the front that fronts on Piney Meeting House Road that qualified for an abutting mains connection under the standard policy. And what that policy says that is if you want to subdivide a property that qualifies under abutting mains, then one property can be approved under abutting mains. The remainder of the property is excluded from using abutting mains in the future. And so right now, the property to the south, the yellow property, would qualify for abutting mains connection under the abutting mains policy. The piece to the north, the outlot, does not. And what these owners would like to do is to, well, the original request was to transfer their connection right from the main property to the outlot. Now, you've probably heard more recently in testimony from the owners that they would just like to get approved for the outlot, period. They don't really care so much about transferring a development right, although it could be perhaps accomplished in that way if there were a policy allowing them to do such in the water and sewer plan. But there is not, and that was not supported by the executive in this particular case. We have worked with Park and Planning to try to identify a re-subdivision of the outlot and the southern lot. that would allow the outlot to get that connection and therefore leave the outlot as the odd lot out, if you will, as the one that's no longer eligible for a connection. The request here is for a house for the property owners to build for one of their children. There is no child lot policy that we can use in this case to allow this to go forward. And my guess is that if this is not approved this time around, we will see it again.
Yeah, a couple,
So,
yeah.
but the plan does not, well, unlike the previous issue, the plan does not include a policy modification to abutting mains that would allow this request to go forward.
You say the draft plan does not include that?
The draft plan, yes.
Right, so that's why staff identified it in the packet, because the request was deferred pending review of a potential solution within the 10-year plan. The one point, a couple points. First, we don't know what could be built on that outlot. If you look at the picture, it looks a bit ominous. You've got, water, some sort of water resource in the middle of the lot, but we can't speak to the actual conditions on the lot itself. That would be a separate process as to what could be built. But assuming something could be built there, Mr. Sukup mentioned the potential to re-subdivide, since they're under common ownership, that outlot and this lower lot, to do a minor re-subdivision that would effectively allow for the abutting mains rights to end up with the outlot, or what is the new defined area of the outlot, and would be then removed from what is this lower area. And staff raises in the report, if that is possible in this case, is that really something we want to require the applicant to have to go through? Or is there a methodology we could consider that would allow for transfers in limited circumstances? And I did include in the packet on page 7 some ideas for how you might accomplish the same thing, but still have that limitation so it would not be broadly applied. And I've got it bolded on page 7, so I can just walk through that. First, obviously both properties have to abut a main to be eligible. The properties would need to be contiguous, basically share a property boundary, which these do. They'd have to be under common ownership for this to apply. And then I think getting at the concern that's been raised about the potential for adding additional development through this, ultimately adding additional development. Under the scenario that you build on the outlot and then down the line you have a septic problem on this already developed lot, and then they would then become eligible through the through a documented failed system. And so you end up with 2 developed pieces of land and all the impervious area associated with that, when the original concept of the abutting mains policy would not have allowed for that. So staff's suggestion there is that as part of the requirement for this transfer, the property that is transferring the right, if you will, would have to have a documented, well-functioning septic system. And I'll be the first to say I'm not exactly sure how you define that, but I think our DEP and DPS folks could probably help us with some language that would get us to where we would want to be with that. And the reason for that would be so that we don't come back in 2 years with a septic failure on this southern lot, that we have some confidence that this property will be functional on its on-site system for many years. So that's the concept there. And since this property could develop through, or could have this outlot developed through a re-subdivision, staff feels that this other approach is worth considering, that it provides a clearer approach, doesn't require what I think is a lot of work to sort of get around the issue at hand. So that's what staff's suggestion in this case.
I'm with staff. Let's
Yes.
appreciate your
Support that.
patiently crafting this. in identifying a very pragmatic path.
Now, the one caveat I'll say is that I still want to work with DEP and DPS on that additional language that you can look at in October, so that we can have something a little firmer, especially on the functioning septic system issue.
Well, Alan, functioning is not really defined in law, is it? There's language about best available septic technology, right, in the septics law, if I remember.
Yes, the easiest method of that is to have DPS confirm that the current system meets all county and state standards.
Sure, okay.
And back one more time. There we go. The third item on this page addresses a policy under abutting means that's not been used very often. It allows for multiple abutting mains connections on a property, primarily for a subdivision. If there is an environmental resource that can be preserved, and usually that's a forest or tree stand, by providing public sewer instead of using septic systems. We've used this, I believe, 3 times in the last 20 years. It was a policy that the council asked us to include in the abutting mains policy to address some very specific circumstances. What we found over the years, even just those 3 times, is that it's not based on science, if you will. It's based on an interpretation or an understanding of whether or not a particular property in a subdivision could be served by a septic system and where that septic system might go. It requires a lot of coordination between us and DPS, whether can you do this, can you not do that, but it doesn't, it's based on assumptions. What we'd like to do in the draft policy is to remove that assumption process and put in instead actual testing and approval of septic system sites on the subdivision. And the number of lots that could be approved for sewer in this particular case would be limited to the number that could receive approval for an on-site septic system. It's very clear cut, no interpretation that we can see. And it would leave the possibility that's presented by this policy in place, but it would make it much more straightforward to implement.
And staff was supportive of this language, and I don't believe we received any negative comments from the planning board or planning board staff either.
Sounds good.
Okay. Private institutional facilities. This hopefully is not as bad as you're thinking it is. One issue that came up for us with the Park and Planning Commission was a policy that we instituted in the 2018 plan update that requires a private institutional facility user who's seeking a category change to first submit a concept plan for that proposed development to Park and Planning. Park and Planning reviews it as a concept plan, provides their commentary and the agency commentary back to us, which we can then interpret and send on to the council as part of their review of the category change request. What we wanted to do with this was to try to keep the council from having to do their own evaluation of a potential development on a proposed PIF site. Park and Planning had concerns with that. We did a couple of cases like this, and because a concept plan addresses not just septic versus sewer, it addresses a whole host of issues, imperviousness, community impacts, forest conservation, and so on and so forth. They asked us to modify this policy to focus on really just 2 issues in the concept plan review, which is imperviousness, which has always been an issue for the council, and on the actual extension of public water and sewer service, which is pretty strictly defined in the policy. There is nothing in the policy right now on imperviousness. So we have modified the policy to include that language, that the focus for the council is on imperviousness and on actual main extensions. And that seemed to be satisfactory to Park and Planning. And would probably make life a lot easier for the council too, we hope. The same issue comes forward when there is a change to a PIF development concept. The poster child for this particular issue has been the Jesus House site in Cloverly on New Hampshire Avenue, where initially a relatively small institutional use was proposed, and the council granted approval for that under a number of conditions which they were able to satisfy. Come forward 15 years, that user was not able to do the development they had proposed. The property changed hands several times and now is in the hands of Jesus House DC. They are now proposing, or they have proposed, a much more intensive development of the site. A large place of worship, a private school. Now, they were still able to satisfy the particular policy requirements required under the council's resolution. And so they have moved forward with a final approval for public sewer service. Given that situation, we crafted in the 2018 plan a requirement that if the Park and Planning Commission, again, sees that there's a significant change in the proposed development of the site, the new developer has to go back through with a new concept plan with Park and Planning that we can present to the council, so that there's not a question of is this going beyond the limits of what the council approved previously. The council has another opportunity to decide whether or not it's satisfactory. And so we put that into this draft of the plan as well. And the executive also asked us to include a statement in the PIF policy on what is known in development circles as RLUIPA, which is the Religious Land Uses and Institutionalized Persons Act under federal law. What this act says is that you cannot burden a religious institution more than any other use in the decisions that you make with regard to land use, water and sewer, so on and so forth. So this doesn't really change the plan per se. It does provide an explanation that we understand RLUIPA and that we are agreeing to abide by its requirements. The next issue is what we call the On-Site Systems Management Program. This was a recommendation in the 2018 plan that we develop a program which the council supported to provide better information to on-site systems on-site systems users in the county. We know that there are about 19,000 septic systems in the county, a fewer number, about 12,000 on-site wells. But the county, up until now, has not done very much to reach out to those owners. Once they have their systems approved and permitted, until they have a problem with them, they're not involved with the county at all, really. So we are working on an education program for outreach to these property owners. We did an outreach to them last year to let them know that we were considering this program and to give them better referenced information that we provide on our website. We'll be doing more mailings to them, hopefully in the next year or two. The other thing that that program recommended was that we institute some kind of management program, not just information, but that we manage these systems. And so the recommendation was to have a requirement that property owners pump out their septic tanks at least once every 5 years. We have put together language for that in terms of a bill. Thank you. A bill to modify county law, which you will all be seeing at the end of October, I believe. But again, this language in the plan updates where we are with this process. So again, not huge policy issues, but again, an update that tells people where we're headed. Okay?
Yeah, just to clarify, the committee, the T&E committee is taking up that bill, I believe, in mid-October.
Legislation, that's the word I was looking for. Legislation. Yep.
For Bill 4021. So
Yeah.
depending on where that goes, that will obviously be.
I think we were encouraging you to move in this direction, if I remember right.
Yep.
In the previous hearing, yeah. Glad to hear it's happening.
Let's see. Next. Water and sewage systems financing, you've had an earful of this today. This is about the program that the Bi-County WSSC committee has been working on. The plan updates where we are with this program. And again, nothing that you haven't heard already this afternoon. But we wanted to make sure we were up to date on where this stood. Okay. Glen Hills study area and Potomac RE1 and RE2 zone properties, which is the Potomac Peripheral Sewer Service Policy. We have a number of requests that are coming to you hopefully next month in the Glen Hills area, where property owners are claiming that they can get considered for public sewer service because they are adjacent to the planned service envelope. Unfortunately, they are adjacent to the planned service envelope within the city of Rockville. Now, we don't tell Rockville what their envelope is. They don't tell us what our envelope should be. So we want to be sure that we have language in the policy that excludes the city of Rockville, like other areas, from being considered for use for that peripheral service policy.
Without objection.
Okay. Jonesville and Jerusalem, if you're not familiar, these are two neighborhoods on the north end of Poolsville that receive public sewer service from WSSC. However, they receive their wastewater treatment from the town of Poolsville. WSSC's main flows into the Poolsville wastewater treatment plant. We have been hovering at times very near or above the agreed to limitation of 20,000 gallons per day flow into the Poolsville plant. And WSSC is helping us by looking at that issue and trying to find out why our flows seem to be higher than normal. And so again, we are working with WSSC to address this issue. If we find that there is not a technical issue to resolve with regards to this problem, we see the need to either put additional restrictions on the number of connections allowed in the Jonesville and Jerusalem area, or to go back to the town and see if we can negotiate for additional capacity. And the last one here is the Riverwood Drive restricted sewer service area in Potomac. If you want to drop down to the next slide. No, the next slide beyond that. Okay. The area that you see in yellow here was adopted as a restricted sewer service area by the county council before the 2002 master plan was completed. So it was existing when the master plan was done. The reason for this restricted sewer service area was the council's approval of a gravity and low pressure sewer main running down Riverwood Drive, which is highlighted on the sort of the northwest corner of the slide where you see Riverwood Drive sewer extension. That's the new main that was put in. The council did not want any of the properties in the areas highlighted in yellow to be eligible for public sewer because we built this main extension. And so that was adopted in the plan and has gone forward over the years. In reviewing the details of the plan for this update, we realized that a substantial part of the area that's shown in yellow, the restricted sewer service area, is already served by public sewer. Those are all the red lines that you see within the yellow area. Part of that area is within the planned service envelope. Part of it was approved because of abutting mains cases or health problems. So we recommended in this plan modifying the actual restricted service area to the area shown in the green crosshatch. The other area that's in yellow that is not served is technically infeasible, we feel, of being served from that Riverwood Drive sewer. There is a deep, deep cut that runs along Sandy Landing Road that would make it infeasible to extend public sewer into this area. County council staff, if you want to hit the next one, came up with a modification which we are agreeable to, which is to leave all those areas that do not have sewer service now within the restricted sewer service policy area, and to exclude only those that are already approved for public sewer or have access to public sewer service. And that's acceptable to us. We just wanted to cut the fat out of this one if we could.
And the rationale there was 5-10 years down the road, people forget necessarily, oh, we didn't know sewer was possible. Well, now it is. This makes clear that it's still not, that area is still not eligible, even if it somehow were to become feasible in the future. So
And
it's
again,
just
it's
a belts and suspenders type of.
It restricts service by an extension from the Riverwood Drive sewer only.
Right. They could still get service theoretically if they were eligible from another.
And I think that's it. Any questions? No. Other, Paul? Oh, council staff.
Yes.
I defer to Keith.
Some other issues that were not directly or indirectly addressed in the plan that staff wanted to make sure we talked about. The first one shown at the top of this chart is the community service for commercial sites outside the planned service envelope. And I included in the packet a memo we got from the county executive back in January, where he indicated that he was planning to send over a policy, although he also noted he was not actually supportive of it. He preferred a revisiting of the master plan if we wanted to go that way. However, that he was going to send over a policy to assist the council. We haven't gotten the policy yet, so staff took the opportunity to develop some criteria, I think, that gets at, I think, what we're looking to try to do with this policy without having an unduly broad policy that would apply beyond that. One key thing to think about, since this is in the water and sewer plan, the policy itself would otherwise apply countywide, so we do need to be careful there. If you were to deal with it in the Potomac Subregion Master Plan, obviously it would be very specific to that. So in the packet, I'm just trying to find my space here. Yeah, on page 8 and 9 of the packet, I have a bit of a write-up on this, and based on some discussions with DEP staff, so I'm trying to some degree, perhaps predict what may be in the executive policy we get. Hopefully we'll get it between now and October. But if not, I still wanted the council, or the committee at least, to be ready to make a recommendation. I've included some ideas for some criteria for this policy. First, the bullets start on the middle of page 9. First, I suggest that we exclude certain zones from the policy. The rural zone and the ag reserve zones. That would still leave many other zones where you might have some rural commercial activity, including the ones that were the subject of the deferred requests that we were talking about before, as potentially eligible. Another issue that may be a little more difficult to define would be whether you want to limit the policy to certain commercial uses or not. I spoke with our planning staff here at the council, and they didn't immediately come up with a place where we could go and say, okay, those uses are okay and these are not. We would have to create that. So that's something that if the committee were interested in that, we would need to create that list ourselves for this policy, which we can work on if you're interested. Also consistent with other policies, staff suggests that the main extensions that are required to serve these properties would need to remain or stay within the public rights-of-way and avoid sensitive areas. This is consistent with, for instance, the peripheral sewer service policy, where you're providing the potential for properties to connect, but you don't want the impacts of that connection to be so great. that you have significant environmental or other impacts from construction. The main extensions should not result in the need for additional public infrastructure. This can be important, especially with commercial properties on low-pressure mains, for instance. You don't necessarily want to create a situation where there's new public infrastructure, like a pumping station or something, that then has to be maintained in perpetuity by WSSC. Which would be, a cost impact. Another issue that's also pretty consistent with some other special policies is that the new main extensions would not open up service to properties that are otherwise ineligible that would then abut those. So you're explicitly noting that, yes, you may be crossing other properties, but they're not going to be eligible to connect. In some cases, they may not be able to connect anyway if it's a low-pressure system, but this makes it clear that they're not allowed to connect. And then another question is whether we want to have some sort of limitation on the length of these systems. For context, I've noted that the deferred requests that raised this issue in the first place required main extensions of about 5,300 feet. So we're already talking about pretty long extensions here. And as we've talked about earlier, these are very, very expensive. So we, in discussions with DEP staff, we don't expect a flood of these types of requests, especially the longer the extension is. So it's not entirely clear that we need a prescribed length here, but that's another factor we could consider. And what staff would suggest is if the committee is interested in pursuing this, staff can sort of formalize some of this language, either with or without the executive policy, depending on when it comes over, and present that back to the committee at its October meeting. Did you have anything to add?
It seems like a great list.
I'll add that our expectation is that the draft policy will come over with the next group of category changes, hopefully by the end of the month.
Okay.
I just want to say thanks. This is nicely crafted.
Yeah.
It's always seemed to me to be a very reasonable approach here. So I'd like to see this move forward.
Mm-hmm. Fully agree. Okay. Keith, I got to jump by 4.
Right,
So
okay,
I think we're pretty far along.
Yeah, I've got, there were just a couple other issues I wanted to highlight. And it's interesting, most of what we've talked about has been in Chapter 1 of the plan, which is where the policies are. But there's several other chapters of the plan, including a discussion on regional water supply and raw water storage. The current 10-year plan update does include language, and I'm quoting on page 10 of my packet, recommends a more comprehensive reevaluation of the potential benefit to the Wssc water supply system from the eventual closeout and acquisition of the Truvilla Quarry for purposes of increasing raw water storage capacity and resiliency for the region. The recommended plan update includes essentially the same language. And actually, there's a language referencing the quarry in the Potomac Subregion Master Plan as well. But we've had a lot of activity in the region with regard to regional water supply issues over the last decade. And because of that, I asked Wssc Water staff to provide some updated language on this issue, on where it stands, and so that we could include that in the plan, so that we're up to date in the plan with all that's going on. So what I suggest is we'll finalize that language and bring that back to the committee for its presumably fairly quick review in October. But just wanted to let you know that was coming.
Great.
And the other area I wanted to mention, we talked a little bit about it already, is the Glen Hills study area issue. And we also talked about the on-site system survey areas. You did hear in public hearing testimony from some representatives from Glen Hills supporting a reopening of the Potomac Subregion Master Plan for a limited amendment to look at septic and sewer policy issues in Glen Hills. So I wanted to mention that had come up at the hearing, and that it was something that the council had supported back in 2016, I believe, in the resolution. They also noted, and Alan mentioned this earlier, they're concerned about the requirement that you have a documented failure before you can have a survey be initiated in a particular area. Now, this is a county-wide policy, not specific to Glen Hills, but it happened to be, it did impact a survey area in Glen Hills that had just initiated, but did not have a documented failure, so that survey was stopped. So the other suggestion they had was to reconsider that prohibition on survey areas, go back to the way it was prior to 2018, basically, when the change was adopted in the last plan update. So I just wanted to note that for the committee. If the committee is interested in looking at that, we can do a little bit more work on that and bring that back in October. But that was not something that's changed in the plan update. It's not something that staff had initially noted for its own discussion either. This is something that came up at the public hearing. And I believe with those issues, I think we've covered all the major issues that the executive had covered and the issues that I had identified beyond that. So if there's anything else, let us know now and we can try to, I know you're short on time now, we can bring whatever else you want back in October.
I can add that a more complete listing of all of the significant revisions to the water and sewer plan is included in the draft Appendix F.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I don't have any more questions. This is really helpful. I think we got pretty far today. We have a good to-do list for October 3rd.
Right. And just to note, just not to put too much pressure on the committee, but October 3rd is already tight because we will need to turn it around for a council work session and then another date for council action.
Right.
So you can do the math. We're up against it. So, and you've also got Thrive and other issues competing for council time. So just as an FYI, we'll be trying to work towards that date.
We'll work hard to be well prepared for that session. Any other questions? Great. Okay. Appreciate all the work that went into this. Thanks for bearing with us and
A lot of work.
all your prep, Keith. Really appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks, gentlemen. Good to have you.